Hello and welcome to Two Car Pros. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to replace the front brakes on a 2008 Dodge Grand Caravan. Now to do this repair, you're going to need a couple of tools and I'll call them out as I go along. Now before you take the vehicle out after you've replaced the brakes, it's important that you break in the brakes properly, and I'll explain how to do that at the end of this video. This is a fairly simple repair that anybody could do in a garage type situation. Here's a great link up here on the card to how to jack up your vehicle in case you don't know how to do that. It's fairly simple. I have a great video. Other than that, I think we can just get going. All right, I am here on the passenger front tire with a 19mm socket. The parking brake is set and the vehicle is in park. While it's still on the ground, we need to get our 19mm socket and break all the lug nuts loose. Now, if you don't have a 19mm socket and breaker bar, you can use the tire iron that came with the vehicle. Now you might have noticed that my plastic wheel cover is already missing. That's because this vehicle didn't come with one. If you have a plastic wheel covering on top of your lug nuts, you're going to need to remove that before you get to this step. It just pries right off though. You don't really need anything special. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is remove the wheel. Now that the lug nuts are broken loose, we should be able to get them off by hand. Now if you're having trouble getting one of these lug nuts off, like this one was, you can kind of jiggle the tire and it'll go loose on you. As for the last one, again, you can use that wiggle trick I just showed you. But, I mean, this is the last lug nut holding everything in place, so you kind of want to hold on to the tire while you're removing it. Now, your wheel is free to come off. Just be careful to not land on your toe. This next step is fairly simple. In order to get this brake assembly into a more workable position, we're just going to grab it like this and force it the way we need it to go. You can also just turn the wheel from inside the cab, but I have the car up in the air, so that'd be really difficult. The next thing we need to do is grab a 13mm wrench or socket and remove these two bolts. They are the bolts that hold the caliper to the brake assembly. And they might be a little stuck, so you might have to fight them a little bit. There's the first one. So as you can see on this lower one, right here, when I'm moving the socket, it's also moving what the bolt is held into, this nut slide bolt configuration here. See how that's also spinning? There's a really easy fix for that. We just need to get a wrench in there and hold on to that, or a pair of channel locks to hold the entire assembly. I opted for the channel locks because I could not get a wrench small enough to get in between that gap there, so gotta work with what you got in the field. And just like that, the second one's off. Now, be careful because the caliper is now free. This can just fall freely and you don't want it dangling by the brake line. So with those two bolts removed, we can remove the brake caliper and position it in such a way that it won't fall or dangle by the brake line. You can even use like a zip tie to hold it in place, like through here. That wouldn't be bad. Or around the entire thing. Zip ties are great if you can't find a comfortable position for this. That works pretty good. The next thing we need to do is remove the old brake pads, and those remove straight outward from the brake rotor. We need to keep the back one around for recessing the brake cylinder back into the caliper. And then we can remove the front one as well. They both just pull out straight like this. Okay, so the next two bolts we need to remove are these two big bad boys here. They are 21mm. And yeah, using a 1/2 inch drive on this one because they're gonna be a little tricky. If you're having a lot of trouble with them, use some penetrating fluid to get down in there to break the bolt loose. But it does take some force. Ugh. I don't know why all Chryslers are that way. I'm not sure why, but it seems like all Chryslers, these brake rotor or brake caliper assembly bolts that bolt on the back of the hub here are always on insanely tight. I don't know why that seems that way, but seems to be a trend I noticed. I could be wrong. Okay, with those two bolts removed, we can remove the brake caliper mounting bracket. Now be careful, because the rotor is now free to just drop off, and if that drops on your foot, it will smash it, so keep an eye on that. Alright, so we got our new brakes here. I left a link down below in the description to the brakes I'm using here today. They're a pretty inexpensive kit, but I think they'll work just fine. So, as we can see, the brakes look identical. They're very, very similar. This is a semi-metallic brake. I'm not sure what this is. Maybe it's semi-metallic. I don't know. It came off the van, and I didn't put it there. So, yeah, we can see that the brake pads are the same, which is good. So we can install those brake pads on, and we got to make sure that it comes into a pair, right? But we got to make sure that we give one indicator is on each side, so don't put two indicator pads together. The next thing we have to take a look at is the new rotor. And there it is in all of its glory. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of flack for not using the Mopar appropriate brake accessories and brake parts, but this is for a work van, so I'm not super into performance for it. It's a van. I just want the brakes to work. And I guarantee you, these Chinese knockoff parts are going to work better than whatever the heck these things are. So, what we're basically looking for when we're looking at rotors to be the same, we want to make sure that they're the same diameter and they have the same amount of holes, and this inner hole here is the same size, and it is. So it is the same brake rotor, which is what you're looking for. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is take off the manufacturing grease that is inevitably on the new brake rotor. Now, in order to do that, we're going to be using some carburetor spray. This is available at every auto parts store in the universe, so go pick some up. I also have a link down below in the description if you want to get it off Amazon, which I don't blame you. Prime's great. So we want to spray some on the contact surface on the front side here and wipe it off with a rag. This ensures that any kind of manufacturer's grease or shipping grease or even plastic residue from the bag that's on there, because maybe these have been in storage for a decade, who knows. And then you gotta do the backside too. And make sure you wipe all of it off. You don't want globs of it. Oh, that looks fantastic. So, this rotor is ready to go back on the car, but I'm going to set it aside for now and work on the mounting bracket. There's something we should probably do there. So my brakes did not come with new guides here, so I'm just going to clean up these old ones a little bit. If yours did, you just stick a screwdriver down in here and pry this off, and they plink right off, and then you just replace them. They're no big deal. But what we can do, everybody can do, is remove the slides and clean them off, because there is, well, on this one there's like no grease. So we can remove them, clean them off, fetch some new grease. I'm using some Valvoline General All-Purpose Synthetic Grease. Put some on the end just there. I like to rotate it in and out as I'm replacing, like that. Oh yeah, there we go. See how easy these guides fall off? I barely even nudged it. I'm going to do that for this one as well. So wipe off the old grease. No, you're not going to get all the grease off of there. Stop it. It's okay. This is automotive. This isn't programming. It doesn't have to be 1000% perfect every single time. Just on the important stuff. And getting all the grease out of this boot is not insanely important. We just want to make sure that it's well lubricated like that. So that's really good. Now this is ready to go back in the car as soon as I figure out a permanent way to stick this guide back in, because it does keep falling out. Okay, for this next part we need to recess the piston back into the caliper, and we're going to need our friend, the old brake pad. Now the next part, we're also going to need one of these. This is a 4-inch C-clamp. You can also use a pair of channel locks like I've showed in the past. Okay, so what we need to do is fairly simple and straightforward. We need to put our brake pad back against the piston here like it was, and then grab our buddy Mr. C-clamp here. Oh, the 4-inch one is just big enough. Just big enough to get around the entire housing. And then we're just going to tighten our C-clamp here, and it's more about going slow with consistent pressure than trying to rocket ship it back into its home. It's actually a lot easier than trying to use a pair of channel locks. I should do this from now on. The problem is most people don't have 4-inch C-clamps, but I do. And this is just a cheap Chinese knockoff C-clamp. It's nothing special. You can get these at Harbor Freight for next to nothing, and they're super handy. So we're going to keep tightening this until the piston is fully recessed into the caliper, like that. Super easy, and then we can loosen our C-clamp here, and remove it, and then remove our brake pad. So we can tell that the piston is fully recessed into the caliper when the piston is parallel with the outside of its housing. You can kind of run your finger over it and see that it's parallel. If you are having problems getting your caliper back on, it is because this piston is not recessed into the housing enough. Okay, the next thing we can do is a courtesy to ourselves. We can clean the mating surface of this hub, and we can do that with some carb spray. This is so the rotor doesn't get stuck to this flange here. All right, with some clean hands or clean gloves, we can replace our old rotor with our new one here. Just like that. We want to make sure that it is as far on as we can, so if we leave it alone, it won't fall off and hurt anybody, or even itself. All right, the next thing we need to do is replace the caliper mounting bracket. We can push the rotor flush with the hub there, and then replace that bracket. So the super cool thing about once you get this bracket on, the rotor can't fall off, so you don't have to really worry about it. And now we can tighten them up. Don't tighten one fully until the other one is flush as well. So I'm gonna get to that tight, and then I'm gonna go to the other one. So when it comes to tightening these, if I find a torque spec, it'll be on screen now. I'm not gonna do that, but I can tell you they were very tight. So you wanna try to replicate that as best you can. If you don't have a torque wrench, which is understandable because most people don't. Here we go. That's on pretty darn tight. So the next thing we need to do is replace our brake pads, remembering that the indicator pad was inborn. So we need to replace it just like that. And make sure that you're hugging the rotor and the rotor is fully onto the hub. And make sure you do both sides. Just like that. It should look just like that, like a nice sandwich. Sorry, I haven't eaten lunch yet, can you tell? Now, we can replace our brake caliper. Now, here's the thing. You might be able to see. I've actually twisted it, so it's really tough to get it back on. You don't want that. Make sure there are no kinks in your line before you replace it. And if you've recessed it correctly, it should just go right on once you've pushed the slides back into their home, like that. So now, that's back where that needs to be. And we can replace those little bolts from earlier. They're 12mm bolt, no, 13, see? I forget. They're 13mm bolts, in case you forgot, like me. So these have to be decently snug too. I will put a torque spec if I find one for you. Now, we're having the same problem as earlier, where the slide was spinning along with it, so we can grab our channel locks from earlier to make sure we get this nice and snug. There we go. And if you don't have a torque wrench, probably not that big a deal. When a torque wrench is required, I'll tell you. You don't need a torque wrench for most things. So that's pretty good. And now we can move on to replacing the wheel. All right, so the next thing we need to do is replace the wheel. So once it's here, we can start putting on the lug nuts. And whenever you're dealing with lug nuts, you always want to do everything in a star pattern. So once we're at this stage, we can use our tire iron or 19mm socket to tighten them up as best we can while they're still up in the air here. Obviously, as you tighten them, the wheel likes to spin. So we're going to have to do our final torquing on the ground. Alright, so what you're looking at now, besides my very, very pale leg, is the brake pedal. So, when we recessed the brake caliper piston back into the caliper housing, that created a lot of space. So if you jammed on the brakes right now, the front brakes wouldn't really work. So, what do? You have to remate them. You have to get the piston out of the housing. And the way you do that is you press the brake very slowly. And there will feel like there is no pressure. It'll go down very easily. So you go down about that slow, and you come back about that slow. You do this a few times until you get a very firm pedal. This will let you know that that piston has come out of its housing and is pushing on the rotor and clamping the rotor. I can already tell by the second push it's already getting firmer. A little bit firmer, but it needs to be very, very, very firm. Okay, this is about my 7th cycle here, and I can feel the pedal getting very firm, exactly where I want it. Now, it might take more cycles for you, it might take less, so, you know, just use your best discretion to decide how firm is good. I'll tell you one thing, there really isn't a penalty for pushing it too many times, so better safe than sorry. Okay, so now the vehicle's on the ground in park with the parking brakes set. We can torque the lug nuts here to the correct specification, which is on screen now. And when you're doing lug nuts, always want to go with gravity and in a star pattern. Always a star pattern with lug nuts. Come on. And there we go. Okay, so now the repair is finished, but before you go taking off down those back roads in your Dodge Caravan, listen up. You need to break in the brakes, and what that means is that the brake rotor and the brake pad are machine surfaces, and they don't want to mesh together immediately right away. So if you don't break in your brakes, that can cause a glaze buildup on them. They may not work very well, and the car won't stop, which is obviously the whole opposite of what you're trying to do. So the way you do that is you accelerate on a flat road with no one around, on a flat road to about 10 miles an hour, and then come to a slow, gradual stop. Do that 5 or 6 times, and your brakes will be broken in. Thank you so much for watching. If you could do me one big favor, and that's subscribe and ring that notification bell, I'd be very grateful. And I will see you next time.